So I would have loved to have started this video series on something happier and lighter, but given that we're all dealing with coronavirus at the moment, it made sense to start with crisis. And I actually co-wrote a book on crisis a number of years ago with some colleagues of mine. What we did was we looked at all of the research on crisis in general across all different fields, and then we applied it to leadership in schools during crisis, because that's the space I worked in at the time. What we found, though, in doing the research and doing these studies was that actually there were some core components of crisis that applied to every type of organization. Didn't matter what industry, didn't matter what type of field, didn't matter what country. So that's essentially what we'll be talking about in this 5-part series on crisis. And if you think, well, I run a business and that's entirely different than a school, then you obviously missed the point where I said we looked at research from every field. And also it means that you think your business is somehow protected from ever having to deal with employee dishonesty or fraud, with violence in the workplace, with some sort of disagreement with local politicians, or perhaps with some sort of natural disaster, or I don't know, a pandemic. In which case, kudos to you, and I'd love to come work for, I'm assuming, your unicorn farm on Planet Blurg, because that's kind of the only way where you're never going to have to worry in any way about a crisis that we talk about. So let's assume that you are probably going to have to deal with a crisis, and actually, when we talk about these 5 parts, we're going to start with pre-crisis work, and then move into some other bits, which you'll see here.
So this is part 1, which will deal with how do you build a strong, resilient organization that actually avoids crisis, and if a crisis does hit, is able to deal with it the best. Part 2, we'll talk about defining crisis, because not all crises are the same, and what type of crisis it is will matter in terms of how do we deal with it. Part 3 is around communication. Once a crisis has hit, how do you share information? How do you develop that communication so that it's actually useful and constructive? Part 4 of this series talks about managing and planning. Now that the crisis has hit, what steps do we take? How do we plan that out? What do we prioritize? And how do we communicate that again, to go back to the previous session, to ensure that we're all on the same page? Part 5 is about taking a step back and looking at strategic issues, because while crisis focuses you very much so on the immediate short-term factors you're dealing with, you do need to be able to take a longer look and make sure that the choices you're making to win in the short term are actually going to benefit you in the long term as well.
Given that this is now the end of March and we're talking about the coronavirus, which is obviously hammering so many parts of society, our businesses, our organizations, our people, you might be wondering, why start with pre-crisis? Well, the fact is that in looking at the research, we know that a ton of what actually happens in terms of how leaders and how organizations deal with crisis comes down to not what they do during the crisis, but actually what kind of organization did they build before the crisis actually hit. So I don't know what the percentage is, there isn't a known number, but let's say 93%, just because people like a percentage. But let's just say it's a lot. So a huge part of this needs to go back to actually not just, okay, coronavirus has hit or this crisis has hit, but actually what kind of organization is that crisis hitting? So when we're talking about these really strong, resilient types of organizations that are very robust in the face of crisis, we're talking about organizations that have done basically 2 things. They have really focused on developing a shared purpose for the organization. In other words, why does this organization exist? And they've invested a huge amount of time and effort into a shared set of values. This is what's most important to us at this organization. In all of the research and all the case studies we looked at, it was the organizations that had invested in that before a crisis hit were much more likely to take a hit of a crisis, because crisis is sort of inevitable, but actually be able to bounce back the best and the fastest in the long run.
So just to give you a quick visual of this: purpose, values, mission. Purpose, why does our organization exist? Values, what's most important in this organization? Mission is simply, what do we do here? And again, in a crisis situation, what you want people to be able to focus on is, why are we here? What's most important to us? Because the mission, the things they do, will inevitably change, because that's what happens in a crisis. What you need to be able to do in a strong organization is keep calling people back to not what do they do, but why do they do those things, and why are those things so important? And that's why purpose and values are so essential.
Now, usually when I talk about this with people, they say, well, it's great. We've already got our values or our vision statement or whatever you're calling it up on our About Us page on the website, or you've got it somewhere up on the wall in the office. And that's great. That's a nice place to start. But the reality is, for the most part, those values and purpose are not translating into people's day-to-day work. they're not talked about, they're not engaged with, and so they're kind of meaningless. And actually, if you go into many organizations and say, what are the values or what is the purpose of this organization, you will get a lot of uncomfortable blank stares. And so, yes, they're there, but they're not actually meaningful. And again, when you're talking about crisis, they can't just be sitting there in a document somewhere. They actually need to be something that people feel connected to, engaged with, and that are meaningful to them. If you don't have that shared sense of values and a common purpose, what you get is a very fragmented organization. And to be clear, it doesn't mean that your organization doesn't function at all or nothing ever gets done. It just means that you get the minimum done. You've got people focused on their individual tasks. A lot of times that comes across as people talking about siloed organizations, but essentially everyone there is focused on their own KPIs or their KPAs, on ensuring that they get their bonus. And if they can help someone else, they will, but only after they tackle their individual side. So it's very fragmented, very bitty. And the problem with that, of course, is that you tend to get minimum focus. You tend to get minimum production. What do I need to do in order to get a pass at my next evaluation, to get the next promotion? If you have a shared sense of purpose and a shared sense of values, what you get then are people, yes, they're worried about themselves because they're humans, but they're also much more actively thinking about how does what I do fit into the bigger picture? Our work actually connect to each other in a meaningful way. And they're not just trying to do whatever they need to do in their job description, but they're actually thinking about, is there a better way to do this? What's the best way to actually accomplish this task? Is there a new way to think about this? And maybe I'll talk to someone about that. Central to this, of course, is yes, while you're worried about the individual, if you have spent time bringing people together around the shared values and purpose, it allows everyone in the organization to keep their eyes out for potential threats to the organization, which means you're probably going to see a crisis coming earlier, which means you can prepare for it a little bit better. Doesn't mean you'll be able to avoid all crises all the time, but if you're better prepared for them, if you see them coming, you can spend that time planning. And what happens in fractured organizations is that in a lot of cases people see something, but they sort of say, it's not my job, not my responsibility, or they're slow to pass it on. In a more connected organization, a more inclusive organization, someone will say, look, it's not my responsibility, but I have noticed this, and they'll pass that information along more freely, more openly, and that can help people get their heads on a swivel and see a crisis coming much earlier on so you can start preparing for it. Two other ways that shared values and purpose will come into play, as we'll talk about later in the series. One of them is around communication, which is just if you have a shared sense of purpose and values, it allows you to focus those conversations, to focus communication, to take all of this different information that's going to be happening in the midst of a crisis and focus it in on a couple of key things that are known to be strong within the organization, which allows communication to be much clearer and much more impactful. And secondly, it helps you in terms of strategizing so that when you come out the other side of this crisis, you have something normal to shoot for. So again, what you do might be different after the crisis. The way you do business, the types of customers you have, all of those types of things might be different after the crisis, but what's central to your organization is still going to be the purpose and the values. And if you know those before the crisis hits, that gives you something to shoot for when you're coming out the other side. And that is incredibly important for people to understand that it's not just about getting the sales back up, but it's about coming back together as a collective again. So the next 4 episodes of this series will deal with what to do when a crisis has hit. And for those of us who are dealing with coronavirus right now, that's probably what we're thinking about, but also for different crises in the future. But I wanted to start with this type of stuff in terms of what happens before the crisis, because fundamentally, that's what's going to have the biggest influence on how you deal with this crisis or other ones. So a lot of us are going to find out right now, have we developed a strong sense of organizational culture? Have we got the right people here? Not just the most talented people, people who are committed to the shared purpose and values of our organization. And those of you who have will find that you are, yes, dealing with a terrible time right now as coronavirus sort of wreaks havoc on everything. Those of you who have not, I think you're going to find it's a much harder time. And we'll talk further in the rest of this series about how to deal with if you're in a strong position or in a not so strong position. So I hope this is really helpful, one, for sort of dealing with crisis now as it hits, but also to think about, on the other side of this, what kind of organization do I need to build on the backside? So we're going to move into the next 4 sections that we talked about earlier. I hope you find this very useful, and the next couple of episodes very useful as well. If you have questions or comments, please get in touch.